a lot of turmoil. You had the Hungarian revolt, the Polish crisis, and now we got another problem in the Suez Canal. Later in the year, in 1956, Egypt is going to cause a bit of a mess. And you see the Suez Canal on this map, and it's that narrow little area between Africa and the Middle East, and Egypt controls this tiny little man-made waterway, which allows ships to pass through the Mediterranean Sea into the Red Sea and get to Asia a lot faster. If the Suez Canal is blocked off somehow or didn't exist, you'd have to go all the way around Africa. And nobody wants to add the extra mileage onto the trip. We're talking about an extra 5,000 miles, so obviously the Suez Canal is important. Egypt has control of the Suez Canal. Remember our good friend Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser is the president of Egypt who wants pan-Arabism. He wants to make a name for himself. And he's not particularly interested in siding either with the Soviet Union or the United States. He tries to play them both against each other any opportunity he can get. And one of the things that he needs is funding for a new dam. He wanted to build a dam that would generate hydroelectric power. And to get the funding for that, he flirts with both the United States and the Soviet Union about getting that money, but in the end, both of them end up backing out of the deal. To make money from this, Nasser starts charging ships through going through the Suez Canal. He starts putting pressure on people to pay more money to get their ships through the Suez Canal. This is how he's going to fund this particular venture. Now, certain countries are most displeased with this. Among them, Great Britain and France. Remember, the former colonial powers are a little bit ticked off about this whole business of they used to control the Middle East and parts of Africa, and now the world has kind of rebelled against them. And they're like, hey, we want to use the Suez Canal, and we really don't want to pay these exorbitant prices to help finance your dam. Now, Nasser doesn't really care what the British or French want. So the British and the French cook up a scheme. They know they cannot outright use military force against Egypt. The world would condemn it. There's a possibility that it might not succeed. And it's not like the United States is going to blanket support them on this, and they're definitely not going to get support from the Soviet Union. So Britain and France say, you know what, maybe if somebody else attacked Egypt, and we could come in and pretend to be the peacekeepers. So they turn to the one country in the region who definitely does not like Egypt, and that is Israel. So they cook up this scheme where Israel will attack Egypt, and Britain and France will pretend to come in and be peacekeepers and say, we have to seize control of the Suez Canal. Right? It seems like a great plan, and Israel is game for it. And when they do it, immediately they think the world will go along with this plan because they'll be peacekeepers. Well, the reality is Israel attacks Egypt. Britain and France try to come in and pretend to be peacekeepers, but everybody sees right through it. And the Soviet Union quickly condemns what Britain and France have done. They're like, everybody knows you're just making a power play right here. And they expect the United States to support them. They're like, these are our World War II allies. These are our democratic friends. And America does not support them. Dwight Eisenhower is furious with them and refuses to go along with it. In fact, he insists that they back out of the Suez Canal and turn it back over to Egypt. Now, this is a huge deal because Britain and France, now we see that they're not in charge of world affairs anymore. That they got to take their cues from the Soviet Union and the United States. And in particular, if you don't have one of the two superpowers behind you supporting you, you're not going to be able to do what you once did in terms of bossing around other countries. It's a message to the world as well that the Soviet Union and the United States, if they're not with you, then nobody's going to be with you. Fast forward to the next year, and you got another crisis situation. The Soviet Union shocks everyone when they announce they have launched the world's first satellite into orbit. This right here, known as Sputnik, means traveler in Russian. This is the size of about a basketball, and it transmits radio signals from outer space. The Soviets put something into outer space before the United States did. People are panicked. In fact, we think that we obviously have real problems, and the Soviet Union gets not only a technological achievement, but this is a huge propaganda win. They look at the United States and say, I thought you guys were supposed to be the leaders in everything. But the reality is, we're ahead of you. Our science and technology is better than yours. Right? It creates this perception among Americans that there's what they call the missile gap. To shoot these things into orbit, you needed obviously a rocket or a missile of some kind. And the United States, many of its citizens felt like we were significantly behind and that our missiles were not as effective or did not have the range that Soviet missiles did. And we needed to close that gap. So the United States embarks on a huge technological achievement of its own, trying to not only put something into space, but also to start working towards putting people into space. We also want to work on our missile technology, and that means creating a stronger math and science program. If you think the pressure is on you to perform well in math now, it's nothing like it was in the 1950s and 60s. Students are strongly pushed into science and math. Right? 1950s has a few other surprises left for us, one of which is in 1959, the containment policy is going to see a real threat when Cuba becomes a communist nation. You see Cuba here in red, not so ironically, is only 90 miles off the coast of Florida at its short point. And it's a really big deal because this man, Fidel Castro, leads a communist revolution there. He overthrows the existing government, which had really been very cooperative with the United States, and it exploited the Cuban people. And Fidel Castro takes advantage of Cubans' anger, and he leads a revolution, a communist revolution. This is obviously a concern not just because of the containment policy, but because of the fact that communism is now in our backyard. So what are we going to do about this? Right? Believe me, they start cooking up plans to use the CIA for an intervention, and let me assure you, there were no shortages of ideas about how to kill Fidel Castro. Now, we will get into that more later on, but Eisenhower is getting ready to leave his job as president at this time period, so he's working on a plan to get rid of Castro, but you're going to see that take more shape in the 1960s. One other incident here before Eisenhower leaves office is what we call the U-2 spy plane incident. This right here is a picture of what we call a U-2. It is a spy plane that can fly at extremely high altitudes. The United States had been running these spy planes all over the world at such heights where nobody could shoot them down, not even the Soviet Union. And we were taking pictures of anything we wanted to on the ground. On the belly of these planes, they had high resolution, or the highest resolution they had at the time, cameras that would take pictures so we could see what type of military installations that they had, whether countries or not are rebuilding. And the U-2 routinely flew missions over the Soviet Union. The CIA was in charge of these missions, and we thought no big deal because we're like, hey, we've been doing this for years, and the Soviet Union, they never were able to shoot them down until 1960. The Soviet Union had been working diligently to close this gap. They had a technology problem in this sense. Now, what transpired, the Soviet Union knew that planes flying overhead were American because they couldn't be anybody else's. Nobody else would have had the technology. They never wanted to admit that it was happening, though, because it would make them look weak and helpless, like they couldn't do anything about it. Now, to correct that problem, they eventually get the technology to reach the heights of the U-2, and they successfully shoot down a plane, and the pilot lives. It's a fascinating story where you didn't think anybody would do that. The CIA had even given pilots poison cyanide pills to take to prevent capture, but this guy didn't take it. It's a huge embarrassment to the United States because we have to admit he's our pilot, it's our plane, and we were spying on someone. All right, so Eisenhower, great presidency. The 1950s are an interesting time, but we end up with some struggles there at the end of the particular 1950s era.